Welcome to Civics and Coffee. My name is Alicia, and I am a self-professed history nerd. Each week, I'm going to chat about a topic on U.S. history and give you both the highlights and occasionally break down some of the complexities in history and share stories you may not remember learning in high school, all in the time it takes to enjoy a cup of coffee. Welcome back, everybody. I hope you've been enjoying the episode so far. I want to make sure that this is a podcast you keep coming back to, so please be sure to rate, review, and subscribe. We're getting real close, everybody. Real close. Revolution is just around the bend. As I mentioned a couple of episodes ago, the French and Indian War had been a success for Britain in increasing overall territory, but the costs associated with expanding the empire and providing ongoing border protection from the native tribes resulted in a cash-strapped nation. The answer? Increase those taxes, baby. Obviously, fighting and funding a war costs money, so Britain felt it was their right to levy taxes to recoup some of their costs. Also, they did just do the colonies a massive solid by giving them the one thing that they'd been asking for: more land. But, as you will hear, the passing of taxes led to continuous protests and rebellions. The story of the steps taken in the lead-up to the revolution is fascinating because of its progression. It was this constant back and forth that was like a swinging pendulum, with actions and reactions from both sides. On one side, you have a nation looking to exert its authority over their established colony, and then on the other side, a cluster of individual states slowly but surely pushing for their rights. Although the push for independence was not as unanimous as you might think. So, grab your coffee. Let's roll. After going to war with France on land and at sea, Great Britain had proved its military power. However, that demonstration came with a high cost. In debt, without credit, and in need of cash, Great Britain started raising revenue through the oldest method known to governments, taxing the colonies in 1764 with the Sugar Act. And while the Sugar Act was not a direct tax on colonies exactly, what it did do was strengthen the customs enforcements on any sugar or molasses imported from non-British Caribbean sources. In essence, forcing colonists to purchase their sugar from the British-owned West Indies, thereby establishing a monopoly on a popular traded good. Britain followed up in 1765 with the Stamp Act, a direct tax passed on March 22nd, which required a stamp placed on any printed or paper materials. From contracts to playing cards, if it was made of paper, it was to hold a stamp that was charged to the colonists. The colonists were used to a laid-back approach of the British government and got a little put off by the fact that they were now being told to pay up. In fact, colonists became so incensed that they resorted to smuggling to avoid paying taxes. In the middle of their own credit crisis, colonists were unable to afford the costs associated with the stamp tax. The remedy to fight this? An economic boycott. Organized in Massachusetts by a group called the Loyal Nine, later known as the Sons of Liberty, the boycott put immense pressure on stamp sellers to rescind their posts or face public humiliation. The site of the public humiliation was in front of a Liberty Tree, as it was known, located on the corner of Orange and Essex Street. The Liberty Tree was across from a rum distillery where meetings were held to plan ways to protest Parliament and their unfair tax assessments. Because everybody always has their best ideas after a night of drinking rum, am I right? The Liberty Tree became infamous as a site of open defiance of the Crown. The Loyal Nine organized the hanging of an effigy of the poor lad selected to enact the Stamp Act, Andrew Oliver, in a ploy to put public pressure on Oliver to resign his post. The tree became the gathering place for those wanting to protest, and its title became official when a copper plate was nailed into the trunk, engraved with the words, Tree of Liberty. Liberty trees would soon spring up throughout other colonies and a declaration of support for the rebellious Boston. To guarantee the success of the Stamp Act protest, Massachusetts set about gaining support throughout the colonies and called for the Stamp Act Congress. Almost 30 delegates from 9 colonies participated, held in New York in October of 1765. The result? A written statement addressed to the Crown, known as the Declaration of Rights and Grievances, outlining 14 points of protest, including the rights to a trial by jury and the pronouncement that there should be no taxation without representation. While they pled their case in the document, it was very clear they weren't requesting independence from the Crown. Instead, they wanted to be acknowledged as full English citizens with the same rights enjoyed by those in Britain. In Boston, come November 1st, the day the Stamp Act was to be enacted, there were no stamp sellers available. The stamps sat unused on Castle Island, a small peninsula in the Boston harbor utilized as a fortification and barracks for British soldiers. the public pressure had worked. While many colonists united in the boycott, merchants worked back channels to gain support from their English suppliers. John Hancock, a wealthy retailer you may have heard of, wrote several letters to his suppliers pleading the colony's case. Benjamin Franklin, living in England at the time, also appeared before the House of Commons to articulate the colonists' arguments and request a rescission of the tax. The boycott and the protests lasted about 5 months before Parliament acquiesced and rescinded the tax. However, Parliament wanted to make sure that the colonists knew one thing. They had the ultimate control over the colonies within their domain, and so while they rescinded the stamp tax, they also passed the Declaratory Acts the very same day. In short, the Declaratory Acts said plainly that Great Britain had complete authority to tax the colonies. This should have been a preview to the colonists for things to come. You may have won the battle, colonies, but Britain was going to win the war. Or so they thought. In August of 1767, news came of more taxes being passed by Parliament. Named after the Chief Treasurer Charles Townshend, the Townshend Acts placed a tax on certain British imports such as china, glass, tea, and lead. All items Britain believed would be difficult for the colonists to manufacture on their own. Not about to be bullied into submission, the Sons of Liberty helped circulate a letter calling for the boycott of British imports throughout the colonies. New York, Rhode Island, and Connecticut all joined the cause and agreed to cease importing British goods. As I mentioned earlier, colonists avoided taxes by resorting to smuggling. Aware of this, Parliament added penalties for any individual caught attempting to smuggle any items listed in the Townshend Acts, including seizing of their ship and imprisonment. Harsh. Hearing of the planned boycott, British troops were sent into Boston to enforce the acts and quell any protests that might pop up. By 1770, almost 4,000 troops were stationed within the city. This is a city who only had a population of about 16,000 at the time. Of course, this increased military presence led to increased tensions within the city, with colonists harassing British troops and the Loyalists who continued to sell imported goods. These tensions boiled over on March 5, 1770, when a fight between a colonist and a British soldier led to the deaths of 5 people. Dubbed the Boston Massacre, it demonstrated the fraught relationships between the colonies and its ruling government. Also, to be fair, while this was unfortunate, unnecessary, and completely avoidable, the term massacre is a bit of a stretch. This was a very intentional propaganda ploy by the Sons of Liberty to increase support for the boycotts and the protests of the Townshend Acts. Little did the Sons of Liberty know, Parliament had already repealed most of the act by the time the supposed massacre had occurred. Effective April 1770, the Townshend taxes, except for the tax on tea, were repealed. Instead of being grateful for the relief, the colonists declared they would continue to boycott imported tea, again refusing to pay taxes without representation in Parliament. This boycott was made possible, in part, due to the continued smuggling happening throughout the colonies. There were campaigns to try to convince people to abstain from tea altogether, including a campaign geared towards women that tea was dangerous for their health. Like that was really going to work. But thanks to smuggling, the colonists were able to enjoy their tea while also standing up for their principles of not paying taxes without representation. And of course, for every action, there's an equal reaction, and in 1773, Parliament passed the Tea Act, which allowed the British East India Company to sell their tea in the colonies directly without having to use middlemen, thereby cutting the cost and making the tea cheaper than its smuggled counterpart. Britain took a gamble that colonists cared more about price rather than principle, and would go for the cheaper tea while also submitting to the Crown's authority to assess its taxes. This almost worked, too. Where Britain failed was in the decision to pre-select only certain merchants to be the co-signees of the tea. By pre-selecting specific merchants, Britain excluded and agitated many business owners and helped energize colonists in supporting the more rebellious acts to come. In Massachusetts, dedicated to their rallying cry of no taxation without representation, and for some wanting to protect their smuggling operation, the colonists, spurred by the Sons of Liberty, boarded 3 British tea ships and dumped 342 chests of tea into the ocean. This should sound familiar. It's known in history classes as the Boston Tea Party. Not my idea of a party, but hey, live your best life, right? Obviously, this ticked off the Crown. Don't mess with the English and their tea. It's pretty delicious. And though celebrated in many classrooms today, Boston's quote-unquote party did not have the unified support throughout the colonies. Many believe that the tea should not have been destroyed and that Boston should pay for the destroyed merchandise. And while the Massachusetts colony gets all the ink, there were actually a total of 5 ships filled with tea that landed in the colonies within several weeks of each other, including Charleston and Philadelphia. The other colonies, however, had a much more timid response to the tea. In Charleston, the tea was seized and stored, but not to be sold. In Philadelphia and New York, the ships were not allowed to enter the harbor. Each of these responses prevented the collection of the tea tax without going so far as to actually destroying the goods. And of course, in response to the massive destruction of property, King George III and Parliament decided that if colonists were not going to play nice, they would be removed from the game. And so the coercive acts were passed. Dubbed here in America as the Intolerable Acts, the acts stipulated the closure of Boston Harbor until the cost of the lost tea was paid for, required colonists to house British troops on demand, established martial law in Massachusetts, and terminated the Massachusetts Constitution, ending elections. This progression in punishment played right into the hands of the Sons of Liberty, who would use these intolerable acts to gain support for and the convening of the First Continental Congress to address the ongoing encroachment by the British. The result of this First Continental Congress was the Declaration and Resolves. In many ways a preview of the Declaration of Independence, the document included a Bill of Rights asserting their entitlement to life, liberty, and property. Sound familiar? The First Continental Congress saw the individual colonies beginning to work as one nation. With the adjournment of the Congress and posting of its declaration, the die was cast towards separation and eventual revolution. It would only be a few short months before the infamous shot heard round the world would be fired in Concord, signaling the true beginnings of the quest for independence. Next week, I'm going to talk about some of the individuals who would play pivotal roles in the run-up to the revolution and dive into how their attitudes shifted from wanting rights as Englishmen to demanding separation. If you've enjoyed yourself these last few episodes, please consider rating the show on Apple Podcasts and spread the word. Join me on the Instagram at Civics and Coffee or at the Facebook page, Civics and Coffee. Hey, you want to request a topic? Do that on the Instagram, the Facebook, or shoot me an email at civicscoffeepod@gmail.com. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope you enjoyed this episode of Civics and Coffee. If you want to hear more small snippets from American history, be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for joining me, and I look forward to our next cup of coffee together.